Good afternoon, everyone, dear colleagues and friends, and welcome to this latest session of the ELSI Dialogues webinar before the summer. My name is Ilaria Colussi. I am a data protection specialist at BBMRI ERIC, and I will be moderating this discussion. Today, we are going to be exploring biobank legislation and the lack of harmonization across the European Union. I remind you that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available online at a later stage. I will start sharing my stream for some initial thoughts. Briefly, some background about BBMRI ERIC. BBMRI ERIC stands for the Biobanking and Biomolecular Resources Research Infrastructure European Research Infrastructure Consortium, and it has the scope to facilitate access to sample and data collections across Europe to advance biomedical research for the benefit of European citizens. To reach this goal, BBMRI ERIC relies on a network of national nodes in the member countries, as well as a team of interdisciplinary experts from medicine, social sciences, ethics, law, IT, quality management, patient communities, and industry partners, with shared values of facilitated access to progress in healthcare and disease prevention. In 2013, BBMRI ERIC was set up as a distributed research infrastructure, and to date, it consists of 18 full member states, 5 observer countries, and 1 international organization, making it one of the largest research infrastructures for health research in Europe. As regards ELSI services and research, we provide support on ethical, legal, and societal issues. We operate on the basis of a federated model in partnership with a network of experts from academia and practice, from across both our national nodes and project partners, alongside 3 key cornerstones: research, service, and training. I want to let you know that this webinar is possible thanks to funding from European Union's Horizon Europe Research and Innovation Project, and specifically it is supported by the CanServe project that focuses on providing cutting-edge cancer research services across Europe. The aim is to offer a comprehensive portfolio of oncology-related research services available to all scientists in EU member countries, associated countries, and beyond. So for more information, please visit canserve.eu. And now let's talk about legislation. It may come as a surprise that member states have taken considerably divergent approaches in how to regulate the biobanking field. Some countries do not have specific regulations. Others have adopted instead complex biobank laws. We will be exploring this from the perspective of the unique legal framework for biobanking that is currently in place in Belgium. The Belgian Biobank law was first adopted in 2008, entered into force in 2018, and underwent important reform in 2022. The law is complemented by an essential piece of self-regulation, namely the Compendium on Biobanks issued by the Federal Agency on Medicine Products and Health, and the interplay with relevant data protection rules will also be the focus of our discussion today. Guiding our webinar on this topic, there are some key experts from KU Leuven, which is a highly regarded research university in Belgium. We have 3 guests today, Janos Meszaros, Teodora Lalova-Spinks, and Professor Isabelle Huys. Let's start with Professor Huys. Just some brief introduction to her. She specializes in clinical pharmacology and pharmacotherapy at the Department of Pharmaceutical and Pharmacological Sciences. And she will introduce us to the other speakers. So welcome to this webinar, everyone. And thanks for giving your time and expertise for this major topic. Just a final point to the audience, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat and we will answer to them at the end of this presentation. So, Isabelle, now I hand over to you. Thanks again for being here today and welcome again.
Thank you, Ilaria, for this very clear introduction. And thank you also for participating with us here in this webinar, where indeed several researchers will share with the audience about the biobank legislation. So my research group is focusing on health policy and regulatory sciences, and biobank research and legislation is an important part of it, especially the ELSI aspects related to it. Dr. Janos Meszaros is postdoctoral researcher in our group, and he's actively participating in several European projects where biobanking is definitely part of it, as well as other types of data sharing aspects and aspects of AI, artificial intelligence, and data sharing. So he did his PhD at the university, at the Faculty of Law, University, and he worked also for 2 years at a law firm focusing on IT and IP law. He also started working at the National Academy of Science in Taiwan as a postdoctoral researcher focusing on data protection, AI, and medical law. Teodora Lalova-Spinks is at the moment a PhD researcher in our group at the University of Leuven in the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences, as well as at the Center of IT and IP Law at the Faculty of Law. And her research focuses on the fair allocation of data control and responsibility in precision medicine. And she focuses her research particularly on the legal framework for data and for biological samples in clinical trials. She holds an LLM in international and European business law from the KU Leuven, and also a Master of Laws degrees at the Sofia University in Bulgaria. We will today share with you the insights which stem from research, but also from other insights about the Belgian biobank legislation. We are also actively involved with our group on the scene in practice with working out the practicalities of this with Belgian biobank participants. And we want to share with you this piece of the puzzle in a complicated European regulatory landscape. So today we will talk about the BBMRI.be network, how biobanks are regulated in general in the EU, the Belgian legal framework on that, and also legal obligations for biobanks in Belgium, the interplay with the GDPR, and also what about the proposed European health data space, which is heading and coming towards also a country like Belgium, and how we can work with that also in the future. So BBMRI.be is the Belgian biobank network, which is composed of 20 Belgian biobanks. You see most of them here depicted around the land card of Belgium. It exists since 2013 member of the European BBMRI, Eric, and involves or collects actually collections of different biobanks in a directory. So more than 50 biobank experts are via BBMRI.be united and share their views regularly in the working group, the ELSI working group of BBMRI, where I am actually leading together with Teodora and with Janos, and where we try to find legal solutions for different legal problems that may pop up over the time in this legal context. But I'm very happy now to give the word to Teodora, who will take over now and dive into the details of the legal framework.
Thank you very much, Isabelle, and it's a huge pleasure to be joining you all today. So First, a very quick disclaimer and apology for my voice today because I'm still recovering from a flu, but I'm confident I'll be able to guide you through the Belgian legislation. So before we go deep into the Belgian law, I wanted to provide a short introduction into the general system of biobank regulation in the European Union. And the very first level is related to the international instruments that apply in this field that we can classify in 4 groups. We have instruments like the Oviedo Convention that were designed to provide very general principles for the protection of the human rights in relation to generally bioscience and anything to do with biotechnology. The second layer is more targeted principles related to biomedical research, like the Declaration of Helsinki. The third level is principles applicable to a specific sector or activity, like genomic research. And finally, we have a very targeted, much narrower and much smaller group of different international acts dedicated specifically to biobanking, like the Council of Europe recommendation on research on biological materials of human origin, or the World Medical Association Declaration of Type A. In terms of the legal force of these instruments, so most of them have simply advisory or a guiding power. Some of them have the expressed intent to become a law into the future, but for the moment, they do not constitute a legislation with binding effect, like the UNESCO declarations. And we do have some instruments which are intended to have a legal effect in the European member states, as long as they are ratified into the national law. So this is, for instance, the Council of Europe Oviedo Convention. When it comes to the European Union legislative framework itself, I refer to the start of what Ilaria said at the beginning, that for the moment we have no harmonization in the field of biobanking at all. So there is no specific EU biobank-based regulation or directive for scientific research. However, you might have heard about the human tissue and cells directives that were adopted in the beginning of the 2000s. And they're there to set standards for quality and safety for the donation, testing, processing, storage, and so forth of human tissues and cells, but only in the scope of clinical practice of providing healthcare and diagnosis. Scientific research is not in their scope, but a lot of the national laws that implemented these directives would also provide rules on scientific research biobanking and be inspired by these directives. So it's always interesting to follow this type of legislative evolution. The third layer is related to the data protection rules. So naturally in research biobanking, on the one side, the focus is on the human body material, on the tissue, cells, blood, and so on. But also we have very much sensitive associated personal data to process and to take care of. For instance, data related to the donor of the samples, to the medical history of the donor, and so on. So naturally, the GDPR should also be complied with. And finally, we reach the level of the national rules for research biobanking, which in the European Union are very divergent and very complex. So the different member states could be divided in 3 groups for biobank regulation. The first one would be countries with specific law. And here it is Belgium and the focus of our webinar today. But there are also countries with composite regulations, often accompanied by soft law, like Denmark. And there are also countries with no specific regulation about biobanking at all, like Bulgaria. All of the different existing national rules on biobanking share common features, which is interesting to note. And it would be very interesting to see how this transpires in the Belgian biobank law. For instance, all of the biobanks typically have to be accredited by the national authorities, competent authorities. Usually this is the Ministry of Health. Also, the creation of a biobank normally should always be notified. There should always be some sort of supervision carried out by the national authorities together with the national data protection supervisors. The management of a biobank normally is always committed to a specific individual or an entity. And if it is an individual, this individual is normally a medical expert, a doctor or a pharmacist. There should always be suitable security measures enacted in the different biobanks. Also, most of the European countries share the rule that if it's not possible to use anonymous data and samples, they should at minimum be pseudonymized. And there is always a big role foreseen for research ethics committees. So they should always assess the purposes that the biobank aims to achieve, or they would assess the specific research projects that aim to use the different tissues and samples and associated data. And finally, the principle of informed consent is present in all the European legislations on biobanking. The fact that the donor to donate their human tissue and samples should always provide their consent in writing. And now focusing on the Belgian legal framework. So as mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the law itself was adopted almost 15 years ago in 2008. And it focuses specifically on the acquisition and the use of human body material, both for the purpose of medical applications and for scientific research. But it took 10 years to enter into force, and this only happened in 2018 with the entering into force of the Royal Decree concerning biobanks, which provides additional rules and allowed the specific law to become applicable. Also, just very recently, last year in 2022, there was a very important amendment on the biobank law that changed significantly some of the most crucial rules related to biobanking. And as ELSI group within the Belgian BBMRI, we have been very closely following these new amendments and analyzing them. So what the law contains? First of all, it provides a definition of what a biobank is. Under the Belgian biobank law, the biobank is a structure which, for the purpose of scientific research, obtains, treats, stores, or makes available human body material, as well as data linked to the human body material and the donor. So this is the so-called associated personal data that we should always take into account. The law also discusses scientific research, and that each use of human body materials should be for a specific purpose for the development of knowledge pertaining to the performance of the healthcare profession. So, for instance, this would be the use of tissues and cells for experiments, the secondary use of tissues and cells for research in vitro, and so forth. However, outside of the scope of the law are, for instance, clinical applications, the use for clinical applications in humans of tissues and cells, the use for diagnostic purposes, and the use of human body material in clinical trials. So this is very interesting and very important, because as long as we are obtaining and using human body material in the scope of a clinical trial under the clinical trial regulation, we do not apply the Belgian biobank law. And also, very important that all of these activities, obtaining, storing, making available of human body material and the data, should happen within a registered biobank. So I will briefly go through the main legal obligations for biobanks in Belgium. This is the full list, and in the next couple of slides, I'm going to provide some more details. So as mentioned, we first have to be able to register a biobank, and there are specific rules related to that. There is also the figure of a biobank manager, the need to have a donor identification system, to set up a registry of the material and the data, to set up contracts related to the material and the data, to take care of the personal data, and how exactly the provision of human body material is executed. When it comes to the registration of the biobank, the first step is that we should receive an ethics approval. So this approval should come from a fully recognized ethics committee under the Belgian law on experiments. And this should happen before the biobank is registered with the Federal Agency for Medicines and Health Products in Belgium. So in the past, it used to be that for each project that utilizes human body material, we would have to go for an ethics approval. Now, this ethics approval obtained at the start of having a biobank covers all associated projects. And after we have this positive advice, it is required that biannually the biobank reports to the ethics committees about its activities. The registration with the Federal Agency for Medicines is the next step. And there are specific documents that should be filled and sent to the agency. Next important obligation and a very important figure is setting up a biobank manager, or so-called custodian. The biobank manager is responsible for complying with all the biobank obligations under the biobank law, under the royal decree, and under all associated possible legislative frameworks like the GDPR. Normally, the individual, the biobank manager, must be someone from the medical profession, an MD, a doctor, and this is the obligation, especially when we speak about traceable material. So material that is still linked, it could be traced back to the original human donor. But if we are dealing with non-traceable material, so completely anonymized and no possibility to go back to the donor, it is possible that the biobank manager could also be a pharmacist. Another important obligation is the need to set up a donor identification system for traceable human body material. It is mandatory for traceable material. It includes the setting up of a unique code to be able to follow where the sample is, how it is used, for what purposes. And it really allows the ability to continuously link the donor and the sample. And it's very important when we have, for instance, incidental findings that we would like to feed back to the donor. Another very important obligation is related to setting up a registry. So both for incoming human body material and outbound human body material to be sent to another institution or to another researcher. And it has very standard rules about putting in this registry the type of the human body material, date of receipt, source of the material, whether it was anonymous or it was pseudonymous. Also very important is the need to set up contracts for any transfer of human body material, to be it to another biobank or to an end user, a researcher. This type of contractual agreements could be either individual or it could be a framework agreement. And normally they should contain provisions related to what is the purpose of the research, how the continuity of the traceability will be ensured, and anything to do with the use of the personal data and the allocation of responsibilities towards the use of personal data and GDPR rules. Coming now to personal data use and so-called associated personal data related to the materials and the tissue and the cells. So it is only possible to transfer data that is strictly necessary for the intended use. Also very interesting is that the Belgian Biobank law, in a very unique way, obligates that the biobank manager, the biobank itself, is always the controller in accordance with the GDPR rules on allocation of responsibilities. So we have the figures of controllers and processors. So the biobank is always the controller, the main responsible one for complying with all the GDPR rules. Also very interesting is that when it comes to personal data, the Belgian Biobank law provides a storage limitation period of 50 years. Maximum, the data can be stored after the receipt of the original tissue and samples. So this overrules actually the storage limitation provision under the GDPR, which concretizes that it should always be stored for a very minimal time. When it comes to the provision of the human body material for actual use, the following rules apply. So first of all, the biobank manager can provide tissues and samples only in accordance with the purposes and activities that were approved by the ethics committee at the setup of the biobank. And it should also always be checked whether this is allowed in the first place by the donor themselves, by the human donor. So normally when we procure human body material, always consent should be obtained by the donor. There is also the possibility to obtain the human tissue and cells and so on the basis of an opt-out, so without consent, but as long as there is no objection. But this is strongly limited to specific cases, either the case of residuary human body material, which is material that was obtained during the course of a diagnosis or a surgical procedure or any other clinical treatment of an individual. And after these tissues and cells have been used for their main purpose to provide treatments or to provide diagnosis to the individual, the rest could be used for research directly, as long as the donor, the individual, doesn't object to this use, and they have been informed about that. The same rules apply when it comes to human body and tissues materials obtained from a deceased donor. So this whole system of opt-outs has been inspired actually from the legislation on organ donation in Belgium. And these rules on consent and opt-outs, they're not applicable if traceability was lifted. So when we have absolutely anonymous tissues and cells. So it's very interesting also to discuss the type of support that the Belgian notes of the BBMRI provides for biobanks. So for instance, they have set up templates for the registration with the federal agency and also for the biennial evaluation form that biobanks should go through. Also very important and interesting is the compendium that was created at the level of the federal agency and with support with the Belgian notes of BBMRI. So this compendium is a sort of a soft law regulation, a Q&A system that provides advice on the most challenging or contentious questions related to how to understand the Belgian law and how to apply it in practice. It was adopted in 2019, and currently it's being edited and amended to provide answers to the new, when related to the new amendments in the law. So as I mentioned, the law underwent a very major revision just last year. So the compendium is now being changed. Going now to the topic of how the Belgian Biobank law interplays with the GDPR. There are many, many interesting questions and challenges and possible gaps to be discussed. I will focus only on a couple of examples just to give you a flavor, and I'm happy to discuss later on in the discussion about more. So as mentioned, biobanks-based research involves almost in all cases, in most cases, the processing of sensitive personal data. So the donor's identification details, medical history, lifestyle and behavioral data, and so on. And as anonymization, especially nowadays, it's not always possible. There is a very high threshold for the data to be considered anonymous under the GDPR on the one side. And on the other side, thanks to technological advancements, it's becoming more and more difficult to really have a truly anonymized set. This means that the data always stays personal, even if it is coded, pseudonymized. And all the relevant GDPR principles apply and should be complied with by the biobank manager. So for instance, lawfulness, purpose limitation, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity and confidentiality, and the accountability of the data controller. All of these toolbox of principles is always applicable. And I'm going to now show some examples pertaining to some of the key principles just to see how this plays when it comes to the Belgian framework. So first, lawfulness of processing in general in biobank research. So as you may know, under the GDPR, we should always identify a legal basis, a valid legal basis for the processing and the use of personal data. And the GDPR provides 6 legal bases that are all equal in terms of power. We don't have a preference normally for a specific legal basis. And also when personal data is processed, sensitive personal data is processed, like health data, there are also specific conditions, 9 conditions in total, that should be always also identified and coupled with the legal basis. And when it comes to biobanking, when it comes to the general framework at the moment within the different European countries, literature has identified 2 main models to process data validly. So 2 main ways to decide which one is the legal basis. One model is the so-called consent-based model. So this consent as a GDPR legal basis should be distinguished from consent to donate samples and data and to participate in the biobank research. And this consent should be freely given, purpose-specific, informed, and unambiguous under the GDPR. And prior to the GDPR, member states had different frameworks for consent. And we have seen after the adoption of the GDPR, a lot of the differences in this regard remained. So this framework used to be the one chosen by Belgium. So just before the amendments, normally consent for the processing of data was required under the law, together with the consent to donate the samples, both types of consent. But since last year, since the new amendments into the law, this changed and the legislator chose a different approach. So now Belgium follows the necessity-based model. And under the necessity-based model, we have processing for instance, legal obligation, processing for archiving purposes, public interest, scientific research, or processing for reasons of public interest in the area of public health. And the choice made by the Belgian legislator was to go for a legal obligation, that whenever samples are procured for scientific research, the associated data is processed because we have this obligation under the Belgian law. Another example related to this interplay with the GDPR and the Belgian law relates to the allocation of responsibilities. So as mentioned, the biobank manager under the Belgian law is always the controller. But it is possible in a different context when the Belgian biobank law does not apply to become the processor. And I give here the example of a specific situation related to clinical trials. That is also part of a chapter that we wrote for a book on GDPR and biobanking. So imagine that we have a clinical trial set up by clinical trial sponsors, and the different human body material and associated personal data that is procured within the trial is stored in a Belgian biobank. The Belgian biobank law does not apply in the case of clinical trials. So in this case, the clinical trial sponsor would be the data controller, and the Belgian biobank would be a subcontractor and a data processor. So they would be the ones processing the data on behalf of the sponsor and for the purposes and means identified by the sponsor. However, imagine that the trial has finished and 5 years down the line, the sponsor wants to reuse these samples and this data to combine them with other data sets from other studies and do some secondary use and secondary research on this data. Now, because we are not any longer in the scope of a trial, but in a totally new study, the Belgian biobank law would apply. And because of this, the Belgian biobank would become a controller for the specific materials and data from the original trial that are still stored with it. So suddenly we would have this change in the allocation of the responsibilities thanks to the rules of the law itself. So it's just an example of the complexity and the possible challenges that could come from the rules that currently exist. So as mentioned, this example comes from a chapter that we wrote with Professor Huys and other Belgian biobank experts that provides an overview on the Belgian legislation and its interplay specifically with data protection rules. And the chapter is part of a broader book on GDPR and biobanking, edited by Santas Lockenberger, Olga Zorzațiu, and Jane Rachel, that was made open access thanks to BBMRI. So I've provided also an open access link. It's full of very interesting research to different national frameworks, different national setups, challenges, and so on. So that was my part of today's discussion. Thanks a lot. And I now give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Meszaros, for the discussion on the health data space.
Thank you, Teodora, for the introduction and the explanation of the biobank law in Belgium, and Ilaria and Isabelle for your introduction. Now I'm sharing my PDF. Does the sharing work properly?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you. So in the second part of our presentation, I would like to highlight the connections between biobanking and the proposed European health data space, especially from the Belgian regulation and perspective. The health data space have amazing goals to help in both primary and secondary use of health data. The main issues and main fields the health data space aims to help is the sharing of health data for healthcare, single market for digital health products and services, access to health data for research, innovation, public health policy making, and AI. In the first part, sharing of health data, the main issues are the limited control of patients over their health data and the limited interoperability between healthcare providers. Here, the main areas of work are the control of patients over their data, help in the interoperability efforts, and here there would have main roles on e-health agencies, reinforced EU governance on e-health network, and the MyHealth at EU. The single market for digital health products and services. Here, the main issues are the uneven national legislative frameworks, the uneven quality framework, and the unharmonized procedures for prescription, reimbursement, and liability. Here, the main goals would be eliminating barriers to free movement of labeling, interoperability, reimbursement, and liability. For the access to health data for research, innovation, and public health policy making. Here, the main issues are the low reuse of health data and cumbersome cross-border access to health data and the fragmented digital infrastructures. Here, the main areas of works are governance and rules for access to health data, data verification, and digital infrastructure. In the case of AI, the main issues are the limited provision of data for training of AI, the difficulties for regulators to evaluate AI algorithms, and the uncertainty on liability of AI in health. Here, hopefully the health data space can help in these main areas. Based on this, the proposed European health data space would be a health-specific ecosystem comprised of rules, common standards and practices, infrastructures, and the governance frameworks that aims at empowering individuals through increased digital access to and control of the electronic personal health data at national level and EU-wide. Fostering a single market for electronic health record systems, relevant medical devices, and AI systems. And third, providing a trustworthy and efficient setup for the use of health data for research, innovation, and policymaking, the secondary use of health data, which we will focus also in our presentation. Since the legislative proposal will focus on a number of areas on the secondary use, expanding the existing infrastructure in the member states through the health data access bodies, introduce a European infrastructure, promoting interoperability and data quality, strengthening the legal base for the reuse of health data. In the next slides, I would like to highlight the biobanks in the Belgian system for medical research and secondary use of health data. The following slides are based on the presentation of René Casters. His presentation was health data and basic and translational research, current practices and consequences of the European health data space. He is also part of the BBMRI.be ELSI working group. It is not easy to navigate in the existing and the proposed regulations of the EU on medical research and healthcare. Since the health data space has great promises on both primary and secondary use of health data, the legal landscape is quite complicated since the future interactions with the GDPR, the Data Governance Act, the existing national biobank laws, the proposed AI Act, and law on experiments on the human person are still a lot to learn and a lot to find out how it will work. In the scope of the European health data space, it extends beyond care and health data, since data holder also includes biobank, and electronic data for secondary use also include electronic health data from biobanks and dedicated databases. In the following figure, it is highlighted how health data from healthcare and research might go through to research. From Prof healthcare and research, through patient-guided diagnostic therapies, through clinical trial experiments involving humans, health data can go through various ways, like medical records, and also biobanks, samples and patient data, through ethical review, samples and patient metadata can go for basic research, applied research, for universities and research institutes, where the research data can help for producing knowledge and new technologies, which could contribute to new diagnostics and therapies, which can improve patient care. And in this system, it is highlighted where the secondary use is happening and where the biobanks play a very important role in this process. In the electronic health data space, for the secondary use of data and for the easier access to it, health data access bodies aim to be established. Hospitals, care institutions, social health insurers, and from other sources, care and health data can be accessed. This data can be medical records, electronic prescriptions, health-related administrative data, medical images, treatment data, diagnostic data, and even wider categories of data. This can be connected with the electronic health data catalogs, and the health data access bodies can help to discover this data and can help in a permission and secondary use and access to it. However, there are the goals for both primary and secondary use have great promises. There are still some fields which are not clear yet, and the interactions between the current system and the future one proposed by the health data space. For example, the health data space, it looks like it does not replace the current research practices. Also, as René highlighted, open science requirements remain to exist, publisher requirements on accessibility of data exist, and law on experiments involving humans remain still to exist, and the biobank law will also apply in these cases. We would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much to all the speakers for these three excellent presentations. And as you have seen throughout this webinar, we have learned a lot about how biobanks are regulated in Europe, with a specific case of Belgium. I found particularly interesting the fact that Belgian provisions regard the legal obligations of the biobank. They focus on the donor identification system, for example, the processing of personal data. And I found particularly challenging the change of choice in the legal basis, for example, passing from the consent-based model to the necessity-based model. Moreover, the speakers have gone beyond the expectations because they brought us also to the EHDS world, which is currently highly discussed in Europe. And how Belgian system can interplay with the EHDS is of particular interest, as it is throughout the whole Europe, because all member countries, all member states are nowadays facing this challenge. So to see how to interpret the proposal of the regulation with the current research framework. So I would like to thank you very much for your thoughts, for the excellent points that you have provided to us, and for the food for thought that you have given. Before moving to the questions, I would like to remind you that at BBMRI ERIC, we regularly share research papers and updates on biobanking legislation from our ELSI experts throughout the notes via the BBMRI ERIC newsletter. So you can sign up to this newsletter on our website, bbmri-eric.eu, where you will also find a lot of materials regarding the ELSI knowledge base and the help desk. Moreover, if you enjoyed this recording, we recommend you to share it with your friends, colleagues, to leave a review or a comment on whichever platform you tuned in via, because it helps us reaching also new audiences. And you can watch out for our next podcast episode via the AT BBMRI ERIC socials on Twitter and LinkedIn. And once again, we would like to thank Isabelle, Teodora, and Janos for attending this webinar. And with this, I please to stop the recording and open the floor to questions, comments that you might have. I will check the chat regarding this. Thanks again, and see you for the next episode.